What's up everyone, and welcome back to my Echoes of Time channel. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button today. Let's get started. Nancy Wake, the most desired resistance fighter of World War II. If you are asked to identify the most sought-after resistance fighter of World War II, you may see a defiant French person, certainly a man wearing a beret and carrying various weapons and hidden messages to oppose Nazi Germany's incursion. The beret portion isn't all that incorrect. Actually, French resistance fighters called the Maquis truly did wore the elegant headgear, but the gender part is completely wrong. In fact, a lady named Nancy Wake was one of the most sought-after resistance soldiers of the entire conflict. At first sight, Wake seemed like an odd choice. She was an Australian who had fled her own country, worked as a journalist, and then entered French society, where she became known for her love of good things and her fierce opposition to the Nazis. Eventually, she made it apparent that, despite some cussing and worse along the line, she was not scared to stand up for what she thought was right. She also had a distinctly sinister side to her resistance efforts, despite the humorous and colorful stories of her wartime adventures. She became one of the Nazis' worst nightmares during the war when she told interviewer and artist Mick Joffe, "There had been nothing violent about my nature before the war, yet the years would see a great change. The enemy made me tough. I had no pity for them, nor did I expect any in return." Wake had a challenging upbringing. Wake didn't exactly have an easy start to her existence. Wake was born in Wellington, New Zealand, and came to Australia with her family when she was 4 years old. Other reports claim she was 2. Nancy was the youngest of the 6 children Wake's mother Ella had to raise after her father Charles deserted the family shortly after. Even worse, Ella and the kids had to scramble to find a place to live in a foreign nation after Charles abruptly sold the family home. In his famously direct manner, Wake would later tell the Telegraph, "I adored my father. He was very good looking. But he was AB*****************. Wake remembered a tight family setting that drove her to flee when she was 16, but things weren't exactly better with her mother and siblings. She allegedly resided and worked under a different name in a location distant from the family's Sydney home for 2 years before moving back when she was legally an adult and didn't have to go back to her mother's house. A tragic turn of events occurred when Wake's aunt in New Zealand passed away and left a legacy that allowed him to travel overseas. She first traveled to the United States, then to London, where she studied journalism before moving to Paris in the 1930s, right as the Nazis were about to gain power. She traveled to Europe as part of her journalistic career. When Wake wasn't working hard, she freely acknowledged that she enjoyed Paris's vibrant nightlife. There was some deceit involved in getting there, too, as she purportedly claimed to have knowledge of ancient Egyptian to a Hearst newspaper executive, who coincidentally had a keen interest in the subject. Only, Wake was faking and instead drew gibberish on a piece of paper to illustrate her knowledge of hieroglyphics. According to reports, the Hearst man hired her after falling for it or possibly giving Wake a confused pass. On a journey to Vienna, Austria, she recounted seeing the Gestapo bringing up Jewish individuals for no known cause other than to publicly beat them. Wake highlighted this as a turning point in several interviews, when she firmly committed herself to opposing the tyranny that threatened to seize control of Europe. She stated, "My hatred of the Nazis was very, very deep," according to the Washington Post. Wake further solidified her position by starting to speak with refugees escaping the Nazi dictatorship in Germany and Austria, while France was still a French territory. She had married affluent businessman Henri Fiacre in 1936 and was acclimating to life in Europe at the same time. She was first much at home as Madame Fiacre in Marseilles, a city in southern France, where the two of them resided. However, the Nazis and their Italian allies attacked France in 1940, capturing Paris in June and compelling the French government to capitulate shortly after. Wake started working with the resistance once the Nazis arrived. Wake was in enemy territory since the Nazis had taken over more than half of France and the Vichy administration had been imposed in the remaining portion. That just increased her motivation, and she soon started working as a courier for the local resistance network, carrying people through Nazi-held territory to the comparatively safe country of Spain. Both refugees and fallen Allied soldiers who were left stranded were among them. But taking them to safety was no simple walk to the border. Rather, Wake and her traveling companions frequently had to traverse at least a portion of the way on foot, frequently through hostile country that demanded significant physical effort with the occasional attack by Nazi or Vichy forces while they were at it. It was hardly glamorous, as Wake told a rapturous interviewer via Koff's collections. "Daring. Bloody tiring, if you tell me. Have you ever been over the Pyrenees?" She replied. British officials would send a car up from Barcelona to pick up folks once they were in Spain. Wake exploited her gender and social standing to get out of risky situations along the road. A woman could get out of a lot of trouble that a man could not, she recalled via the New York Times. She exploited that sexism to her advantage, even charming her way through checks while couriering critical information by leveraging her attractiveness and charm, often with the assistance of a strengthening beverage. Wake became famous for his escape, but time was running short. The Gestapo eventually discovered that a particularly cunning resistance member was operating just beneath their noses. They didn't know exactly who it was, but it was becoming more and more clear that this guy had a remarkable capacity to get out of difficult situations. For a considerable amount of time, this person had avoided recognition, but the circle was getting closer. Some wondered if it was a woman. Tension increased when the still unidentified agent was awarded 5 million francs for her capture, which is equivalent to approximately 133 million euros in today's currency, or almost 157 million US dollars. The Gestapo subsequently dubbed the agent the White Mouse. An amiable cafe owner eventually informed Wake that he believed she was being followed. Wake recognized the situation had reached a breaking point, despite her reluctance to leave her husband. But it wasn't an easy journey for her to flee over the Pyrenees. Wake was arrested by Vichy authorities after being repeatedly turned back by inclement weather. They spent hours questioning her. Wake was ultimately saved, as she described in her biography The White Mouse, when a fellow resistance worker appeared and said she was his mistress. Even so, she had to make numerous efforts to cross the strongly guarded border, walking at night while battling a blizzard and a scabies illness. Wake claimed to be a friendly American when her party was being held by Spanish officials, and she was eventually retrieved by British soldiers. She enlisted in a special British unit. Wake departed Spain and finally arrived in Britain after fleeing France in 1943. But she had no intention of remaining there for the whole conflict. Rather, Wake became a member of the Special Operations Executive SOE, an espionage and sabotage agency established in 1940. She had initially tried to join Charles de Gaulle's Free French Resistance Group, which he would later lead to an alarming number of assassination attempts. Wake, though, was turned down. This made it difficult for her to join the SOE, at least until she had a direct conversation with the head of the French division. SOE authorities soon grew to feel that Wake was better suited for more covert operations, according to documents from this period, partly due to her charisma, humor, and tenacity. But charm would not be sufficient for Wake. She also displayed excellent shooting abilities and a readiness to fight in close quarters throughout her SOE training. She would subsequently assert in interviews that she was trained to continuously beat the outside edges of her palms against a desk in order to harden them, which she claimed helped her deal with German soldiers. Wake was a member of an SOE crew that parachuted into Nazi-held France in April 1944, so that opportunity would present itself soon. Their goal was to support the resistance and hinder the Nazis in advance of the June D-Day attack. Wake asserted that he had killed opposing fighters. Wake was undoubtedly fighting in the middle of a bloody continuous conflict while serving with the Maquis, a French resistance force. Although it can be challenging to verify information from a combat zone, let alone from a group of combatants who are purposefully trying to hide their identities, it is undeniable that death is a component of this setting. Later on, Wake admitted that although she didn't enjoy murdering, she had to do it to survive. Using the hand-to-hand combat skills she had acquired throughout her SOE training, she was able to eliminate a German sentry at a weapons facility. This was the only time I used it whack, and it killed him all right. I was really surprised, she said in an interview with The Australian. However, the other death frequently associated with her was not unexpected. Wake claimed to have captured 3 French women in this incident who were thought to be Nazi agents. She interrogated them, freed 2, but decided the other woman was a traitor and had her put to death. I was not a very nice person, Wake remarked in reference to this encounter. And it didn't put me off my breakfast. After all, she had an easy death. She didn't suffer. I knew her death was a lot better than the one I would have got via the Washington Post. She said she took part in raids and other assaults. Wake was responsible for planning Allied airdrops and distributing the dropped weapons and other supplies to resistance fighters for a large portion of her time with the Maquis. In a more direct manner, though, she stated that she was at least occasionally involved in the action, such as when she stated that she took part in a raid on German headquarters in Montluçon. Wake said that she personally threw a grenade into the building during this attack, but she was able to flee before it exploded. It was also not a simple task to distribute guns. According to accounts of her work there, Wake delivered supplies during fierce fighting between the Germans and the Maquis, and after a round of deliveries, an observation plane opened fire on her car. These reports, or at least the idealized ones that occasionally surface around Wake and other SOE personnel, are, of course, questioned by some. Most accounts of wartime SOE agents, particularly women and especially in France, contain large doses of romantic twaddle, according to historian Max Hastings via The Secret War. However, some details of Wake's testimonies, like her SOE documents, clearly check out, and it is unfair to expect resistance troops in the thick of a taxing, frequently brutal attack to record every detail. Wake employed gender preconceptions and opposed them. Wake had already discovered that her gender might be a strength in her resistance activity before she was compelled to leave France. I'd see a German officer on the train or somewhere, sometimes dressed in civvies, but you could pick him, she stated to the Australian. So, instead of raising suspicions, I'd flirt with them, ask for a light and say my lighter was out of fuel. That was sufficient to temporarily dispel suspicions, but even Wake's cunning and good fortune could only last so long before she managed to flee over the Pyrenees. After parachuting into occupied France in 1944, Wake's gender was once more a benefit and a nuisance. She apparently got caught in a tree after parachuting into the area. Wake told him to cut out that bull ****T and get me out of this tree via Mission France after resistance leader Henri Tardivat eventually located her and said he hoped that all the trees in France bear such beautiful fruit this year. Wake established and prevailed in drinking competitions with other skeptic Maquis. According to another resistance fighter, she is the most feminine woman I know until the fighting starts. Then she is like 5 men via the Washington Post. Another resistance fighter, Major John Farmer, recalled to The Guardian, I had never seen anyone drink like that, and I don't think the Maquis had either. We just couldn't work out where it all went. Her most well-known misadventures involving a bicycle. Despite the story's colorful happenings and the drama of battle, Wake's most well-known wartime achievement included a simple bicycle, evoking the actions of some lesser-known World War II heroines. Naturally, though, this was no leisurely ride in the park. Wake embarked on an incredible quest to restore touch and maintain communication after a German strike damaged communications equipment essential to the resistance effort. She claimed to have ridden 500 kilometers, about 310 miles, through hazardous enemy area over the period of 3 days. In order to avoid being caught, Wake reportedly had to maintain a low profile and sleep in haystacks and other obscure locations. In The White Mouse, Wake detailed the agony of continuing to ride the bike towards the end of her voyage, even though she was aware that she wouldn't be able to continue if she stopped. Her countrymen welcomed her with excitement when she eventually made it back to safety, but Wake's response was much different. She said, "I cried," to the Australian. Despite the brief mental and physical setback, Wake's mission was successful in reopening connections with the Allies, and she was soon prepared to resume fighting. I couldn't stand up, I couldn't sit down. I couldn't do anything. I just cried. In the end, she would cite this mission as her favorite wartime experience. She amassed a large collection of medals, which she later sold. Wake tried her hardest to return to regular life after the war. Only then did she find out that her husband had been killed by the Gestapo, a tragedy that plagued her well into her golden years. She did get married again and moved back to Australia, where she made several unsuccessful attempts to win political office. Following the war, she received numerous medals and other honors, such as the Médaille de la Résistance, the Croix de Guerre from France, and the title of Chevalier of Légion d'Honneur. In the meantime, she received the George Medal from the British and the Medal of Freedom from the United States. However, Australia was hesitant to give her any comparable recognition, maybe due to the fact that she wasn't officially an Australian citizen. She didn't receive the Companion of the Order of Australia title until 2004. But Wake had little sentimental attachment to her medals. She raised money for her own maintenance in the 1990s by selling the majority of them for $156,000. By the time Australia finally honored her, she had already relocated to the United Kingdom. There was no point in keeping them. I'll probably go to hell and they'd melt anyway was her argument, as colorful as usual via The Guardian. In her last years, Wake's expenses were covered by a hotel and a prince. Wake relocated from Australia to London in 2001, intending to spend the remainder of her life there while staying at the Stafford Hotel. She gained so much notoriety that she was given a special seat at the bar known as Nancy's Chair, where she would frequently be seen enjoying a drink and entertaining patrons with her tales. Perhaps since Prince Charles promised to cover some of her expenditures before the new Caroline era of King Charles III began, hotel management never evicted her even when her money ran out. After a visit to St. James's Palace, where she reportedly declined tea in favor of a stronger beverage and brought a dessert home in her purse, Wake was shocked to learn that she had never requested for his financial assistance. The Australian government paid for Wake's expenses at the Royal Star and Garter Care Facility when she suffered a heart attack in 2003, forcing her to leave her cherished Stafford Hotel. She stayed there until her death in 2011 at the age of 98. As requested by Wake herself, her ashes were dispersed 2 years later in the area where she was active during the war, close to the French village of Vernioux. Following the ceremony, attendees reportedly went to the mayor's office for a reception that included drinks, as Wake had also instructed.